Hi, my name is Cameron, also known as Venus Theory, and in this video, I'm here to show you some practical applications for the new PSP InfiniStrip plugin. In this video, we'll be taking a look at using InfiniStrip as a general channel strip, as a bus processor, as a transient controller, and using InfiniStrip to control the stereo image of our tracks. So, let's hop into the DAW and get started. To begin, let's first take a listen to the unprocessed tracks of this mix. The only active processing is a single instance of InfiniStrip here on the drum bus. This is only being used with a clean gain module to roughly level match the volume. Beyond that, this instance of InfiniStrip isn't adding any further processing or color. Now, let's take a listen to the mix with all of the InfiniStrips activated. All of the extra tone and color you're hearing comes from the InfiniStrip, as it's the only plugin being used to mix this session. First, let's examine InfiniStrip being used as a basic channel strip. On the clean electric guitars here, I've got an instance of InfiniStrip only using a handful of modules. To compare the changes, we can mute these modules to bypass their processing. Let's take a listen to the clean guitars. First up, I have a pre-70s. This is a nice preamp with a lot of drive that's adding a bit of weight and crunch to the guitars. Next up, I'm adding a basic filter. This is shaving off some high end above 5K and a little bit of low end below 115 Hz to make some more room in the mix. Finally, we have the retro cue here. This is adding a little bit of low end body, dipping out a little bit of mid-range mud here, and then adding a bit of clarity at about 2K. Now, let's take a look at how I'm using the InfiniStrip for the main distorted electric guitars. For these guitars, we have largely the same setup with a little added control from the master control here. Let's disable the processing by muting these modules and bringing them in one at a time. Before any processing is added, this is what the guitars sound like. First up, I have the pre-60s here, and I'm driving this really hard to add a lot more crunch and bite to these guitars. Next up, I've got a filter module getting rid of some low end below 96 Hz and getting rid of some of the air and fizz up top above 7K. By getting rid of some of the air up top, we retain a bit more definition to the guitar parts. Next up, we have a channel cue. I'm adding a little bit of presence here at about 7K, bringing up a bit more mid-range clarity at about 3K, adding some body here at about 550 Hz, and then adding some low-end weight at about 190 Hz. Finally, to make these guitars really shine, I've got a master control module here, and all I'm utilizing is the width control to enhance the stereo width of the guitar part. Next up, let's take a look at how I've used InfiniStrip on the kick and snare to control the transients and sustain. If we take a listen to the kick drum here, you'll hear that it's a bit muddy and a bit roomy. To begin with the processing, I added a preamp with quite a bit of drive just to add a bit more thump and weight. Next up, I have a fairly steep filter here, and that's shaving off everything above 9.8K. After that, I added the VCA presser just for some classic kick compression. At this point, things were sounding pretty good, so I brought in an EQ. Here, I'm lifting up some low end, getting rid of some low mid mud, adding a bit of clarity at about 2K, and then adding a little bit of presence to the click at about 5K. However, at this point, it was very boomy and ringing out. To control this, I utilized the gate module here. As you can see, I brought down the hold and release, and then adjusted the threshold to taste where I can really only get the thump and punch of the kick without the ringing tail. From there, I adjusted the shape and range to get the sitting a bit tighter in the mix without sounding overly gated. On the snare here, I've employed largely the same channel strip with a different EQ and with an added limiter. First up, we have the preamp to add some weight and crunch, the filter to clean up some low-end information, a compressor for a bit more smack here, an EQ just dialing up a bit of body and a bit of presence and upper mids, and then finally a limiter to add a bit more smack. However, without the gate, this has a similar problem to the kick in that it's ringing out quite a bit. We're also hearing the snares buzz whenever the kick is hit, which we don't really want in this case. To remove that, I added the gate and adjusted the hold and release to tighten up the snare and get rid of the snares buzzing when the kick hits. This ensures that the snare is nice and punchy in the mix, and since we're adding it before the compressor, we avoid bringing up any noise from the snares being triggered when the kick hits. Next up, let's take a look at how I've used the InfiniStrip on the overheads to enhance the stereo image. On the drum overheads here, I've utilized the master control once again to enhance the width after my initial processing. First, I have a preamp, then a filter to remove any low noise from the kick. Then I have a light compressor here followed up with some EQ to add some sparkle and remove a bit of ring here at about 4.5K. Without the master control adding some stereo width, this is what the overheads sound like. In this case, it sounded okay, but I really wanted them to sit a bit bigger in the mix. So I utilized the master control to add some width. On the room mics here, I've actually done the opposite, utilizing the master control to narrow out the stereo image to add a bit more punch to the center of the mix. I also changed out the compressor and used a limiter on the room mics to make them a bit more heavy. Without the master control, you'll hear the room is pretty wide. Once we bring this in though, we can narrow this out and add a lot more punch to the center of the stereo image. Finally, let's take a look at the drum bus processing to see how I've used InfiniStrip as a bus processor. Here we have the drum bus I've used in InfiniStrip, which is actually pretty straightforward. Let's mute the modules to bypass the processing and bring them in one at a time. Without any bus processing, this is the drum mix. To begin, I've got the pre-60s here, just adding a lot of drive just to make these really aggressive rock drums. This adds a really nice explosive character to the kick as well. Next, as a classic trick, I've got the VCA presser here, using some parallel compression by dialing back the mix to about 40%. This has a pretty mild ratio of 4:1, but a pretty aggressive threshold. Then, I'm using the attack and opening it up to let the transients through a bit more. This adds quite a bit of punch to the drum mix overall. Next up, I've got a gain here, and this is actually just a clean gain module that doesn't add any color or processing. This was added later on as a gain staging tool to get my drum mix sitting where I wanted it overall in the mix. Finally, to close things off, I've got the optical limiter here, and this has a pretty open attack with a relatively low ceiling, and I'm just using this for a bit of glue, and I've engaged the soft mode. And that's all there is to the mix. InfiniStrip makes it easy to quickly get your track sounding more polished by using the channel strip mixing format. And you can further dial in the exact tone by changing the modules and the arrangement of the modules on the fly. To try out PSP InfiniStrip for yourself with a free 30-day trial, or get more information, you can head over to PSPaudioware.com.